£22.
The women in prison for being poor, Monday at 8.
Now, keeping you up to date with the latest national news, ITN.
From the studios of ITN, the news with Nicholas Owen.
Good evening, welcome to the programme. The headlines: international outrage after suicide bombers killed 25 in Israel. Mounting pressure on Major tonight, but he insists no one will resign over Scott. And thousands rally for peace as new talks go ahead with Sinn Féin. There's international condemnation tonight of the 2 suicide bombs which killed 25 people in Israel. More than 70 others were injured. One bomb went off on a commuter bus in Jerusalem. The other exploded in the coastal city of Ashkelon. The Islamic extremist group Hamas said it was responsible. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Michael Nicholson reports from Jerusalem.
This is the 10th bombing, one of the worst, and intended like the rest to blow the peace process right off track. The suicide bomber in Jerusalem detonated when the bus was packed, mostly with soldiers on their way back to barracks. Hamas says the bombings were in revenge for the Israeli assassination of their principal bomb maker last month. The bombs come at a critical time for Prime Minister Shimon Peres. He is the architect of the peace with the Palestinians, and there is a general election in May. He was booed and jeered by Israeli right-wing anti-peace demonstrators when he arrived at the scene this morning. The Israeli government today closed the border crossings between the Palestinians and Israel, but insists the negotiations between the two continues.
We are determined to fight Hamas and Jihad without any hesitations, as we are determined to continue the peace process.
When he heard the news, Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian president, denounced the attacks.
It is not military operation, it's terrorist operation. I condemn it completely.
Only last Thursday, Hamas staged a very public anti-Arafat, anti-peace demonstration close to Tel Aviv. Their audacity astonished the Israelis. The ease with which they bombed today now fills them with despair. Anti-peace Hamas jubilant at another successful outrage. Anti-peace Israelis jeering their own Prime Minister at the scene of it. It sums up the tragic dilemma facing this government in the run-up to the general election. Michael Nicholson, ITN, Jerusalem.
Here, the government tonight refused to bow to more pressure from Conservative backbenchers over the Scott report. Government sources told ITN there'll be no ministerial resignations, even if tomorrow's vote on the report is lost. That possibility moved closer today, with the Tory MP Quentin Davis saying he will vote against. Our political editor Michael Brunson reports.
As the Prime Minister returned to Downing Street tonight, the message was almost defiant. There will be no attempt to buy off Tory backbench rebels with last-minute promises. The Deputy Prime Minister was asked, would ministers resign if the government loses tomorrow night?
Well, I don't think we'll lose the vote, and so I think the answer is no to your question.
Perhaps, though, ministers should have gone already.
I think that would have been very unfair to have sort of offered some sort of sacrificial lamb when we actually believed that the ministers were right in what they'd done.
But Tory MP Quentin Davis profoundly disagrees. What Mr Waldegrave and other ministers did, he says, was wrong, which is why he'll vote against the government tomorrow night.
It's never been clearer in the whole of our history that Parliament has really been misled. And you couldn't do more to make it clearer than have this enormous report on the subject. And we can't afford to just ignore that.
Another Tory backbencher, Rupert Allison, believes that by the misuse of public immunity certificates, one of the Matrix Churchill defendants, who'd also worked for MI6, could have ended up in jail.
I feel passionately about British agents being fitted up, being sent to prison, and I'm certainly minded, unless I hear something very positive from the government, to vote against the government tomorrow evening.
But tomorrow, Trade Secretary Ian Lang will only offer a review of export control, some tightening up of customs and excise, and better use of intelligence reports within government. And whatever happens, I am told, there will be no ministerial resignation. Around 6 Tories, Christopher Gill being the latest I hear, stand ready not to support the government. But with some of them and some of the Ulster Unionists abstaining, the government should just scrape home. Michael Brunson, ITN, Downing Street.
Sinn Féin and government officials will hold talks tomorrow, the first since the end of the IRA ceasefire. And as thousands demonstrated their support for peace today, John Major and the Irish Prime Minister discussed on the phone a possible summit meeting this week. Here's our political correspondent, Tom Bradby.
Today, thousands of people all over Ireland made sure their voices were heard. That people want peace has never, of course, been in doubt. It's a question of how and on whose terms. Sinn Féin announced today it would be meeting government officials tomorrow. It has held out the prospect of a renewed IRA ceasefire in return for a fixed date for all-party talks.
What we have to do is rebuild the peace process which has been destroyed by John Major's refusal to move on to meaningful negotiations. And what we have to do is see whether or not we can establish that the British government is going to name a specific date for all-party peace negotiations.
He has said the government was being asked to surrender.
The IRA have quite literally bombed their way to the table, and the terms of the cessation of IRA violence for a further occasion will be laid before the government, and effectively the government is going to be offered terms for its surrender.
The latest phone call between Mr Major and Mr Bruton shows the peace process still does have momentum. The IRA may get a fixed date for talks. The question is how it will prove any new ceasefire is credible, as the government has demanded. Tom Bradby, ITN, Westminster.
America tonight called on the United Nations to discuss punitive action against Cuba after its warplanes shot down 2 private aircraft near Havana. 4 people are missing, feared dead. The US said the attack was a violation of civilized behaviour. Charlotte Hume reports.
The 2 private aircraft were blown apart by Cuban MiG fighters as they flew in disputed airspace. They belonged to Brothers to the Rescue, an American humanitarian group. They were flying across the Florida Straits to search for rafters, people fleeing from Cuba. 4 aircrew are missing. The incident has inflamed relations between Fidel Castro's government and the United States. Cuba claims their airspace was violated. US officials insist the planes were shot down outside Cuban airspace.
The actions that they took yesterday were not justified under any circumstances. The international law is clear. These were unarmed civilian planes constituting no threat to the Cuban government, and as I said, it's a blatant violation of international law.
In Miami, hundreds of Cuban Americans have been protesting against Castro. They're demanding urgent action. Tonight, the US government has called for an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council. Charlotte Hume, ITN.
Back here, 2 West Midlands policemen have been suspended after allegations that they fixed crime figures. It's claimed they persuaded offenders to confess to crimes they hadn't committed in order to improve the force's crime clear-up rate. A criminal investigation into the officer's conduct is being carried out. Salvage experts have successfully transferred almost half the oil left in the holds of the tanker Sea Empress, but more of the 60,000 tonnes of oil that spilled from the vessel have been washed ashore today. Conservationists say the full impact of the environmental disaster is now emerging. Hal Jones reports on the clean-up operation.
No escape from the black tide. Each high water brings yet more exhausted seabirds. Some soaked in oil but still alive, like this scoter, but many others do not survive.
I mean, that's fairly typical.
They had been waiting through the weekend for this delayed but deadly consequence of the Sea Empress spill.
I expected the birds to become weak and have the oil and then start coming in. It's usually 4 or 5 days after the event that the casualties start coming ashore.
While the birds suffered, the beaches lay under sludge. At Pendine Sands, a small army of men worked through the day to move the mess.
This is a clean-up on an industrial scale. Mile upon mile of beach being patiently and painstakingly mopped up by hand.
The only pools on this beach were pools of crude oil waiting to be pumped away. But there's more oil out there threatening to wash up on shore. Each day, these conservationists have been closely monitoring the slick. Tonight, the transfer of 25,000 tonnes of oil from the Sea Empress to another tanker should be completed, but the clean-up will take much longer. Howell Jones, ITN, Milford Haven.
Football, Leeds United are on their way to a Wembley final for the first time in 23 years after beating Birmingham in the Coca-Cola Cup. Brian Dean set up Tony Yeboah for a spectacular overhead strike which put Leeds 2-0 up. The final score was 3-0. Leeds won 5-1 on aggregate. And that's it from the Weekend News team here at ITN. Goodbye.